In this section, we'll explore converting our SUSE enterprise system from local authentication of users and groups to LDAP-based authentication of users and groups using the YAST utility. So let's minimize and navigate to our notes and discuss the task at hand. We're finally making the transition to LDAP from local etc-based files. So migrate SUSE box to LDAP from /etc flat files. Now obviously the features include the ability to take advantage of LDAP authentication, and that means that any SUSE box, once you've configured one, will be able to authenticate against the directory, whether it's hosted by a single host or distributed. So back to our graphic for a moment. Let's find the one with the servers. The directory information tree is hosted by the primary and is replicated to the two slave servers. Once we've migrated this SUSE box to LDAP auth, we can then migrate other boxes to LDAP auth, and any other box that supports LDAP client auth will contact the primary server for user accounts authentication. So now the database will be distributed across the network as opposed to living on a specific host. In the current model, if we needed to create, let's say, 3 users for accessing each of these Linux and Unix systems, we need to create the 3 users times the number of systems existing. So let's say for the 5 Unix and Linux systems, we'd have to create 15 instances of those 3 users, 3 users per box. But with LDAP authentication, we create the users once, redirect the Unix or Linux system to the LDAP servers, and they can authenticate against the shared distributed database. So that's the major advantage of using a distributed DB such as LDAP for user authentication. Now, LDAP isn't restricted to user authentication alone. It allows us to share pretty much any type of tabular formed data from etc, which includes name-value pairs. So, facilitates the sharing of most /etc tabular databases or flat files. For example, etc hosts for a list of hosts, etc group for a list of groups, as well as etc services, and so on. So virtually any etc database flat file can be shared, providing there's an appropriate conversion script using LDAP, which means, for example, if you have a list of hosts that you'd like all of your Linux and Unix systems to share, as opposed to maintaining that hosts list, just like your user accounts database lists, multiple times and having to keep up with the maintenance of those lists, you publish the file, etc hosts in LDAP, and point the name service switch on the Unix or Linux system to the appropriate LDAP server. So these are the features provided by migrating your system to LDAP-based connectivity. Now, SUSE Enterprise Linux provides a simple tool for doing it. So SUSE Linux provides YAST for migrating to LDAP. You may decide to migrate to LDAP or use LDAP from the outset when you install SUSE Enterprise Linux, or later on, as we've decided, when the system's up and running. In either case, the YAST tool allows you to move from one form to another and vice versa. Other distributions, however, don't include such streamlined tools, and in those cases, you have to know which files to update in order to effect LDAP auth on those boxes. So our first task is to set up LDAP auth of users and groups, and we do so using YAST. Now, we have so far connected to the primary server using SSH. We've used an SSH shell. YAST can be executed graphically or text-based. If we'd like to use the graphical version of YAST, we should SSH into the remote system using the X option, which turns on the export of x11 or x.org. So SSH-X connects us and re-exports the x.org graphics from the remote system to the local system. And we'll just note that it exports x.org to local system. That way, an application run on the remote system will be displayed on the local system. And it prompts us, as usual, as is expected. And once in, we have a standard SSH session, but now when we execute utilities, graphical utilities, the graphics will be exported to our local system. And that's YAST. We should have launched YAST 2. And there's the pop-up for YAST 2 on the remote system. Not to be confused with this YAST, which is an instance on the local system. But this is YAST on the remote system, so we can maximize this. Now, to effect the changes for LDAP, we should use the Network Services LDAP Client. In this section, we see LDAP Browser, LDAP Client, and LDAP Server icons. We want to focus in on the LDAP Client icon, as it configures the client nature of LDAP on the remote system, even though the remote system is an LDAP server. So navigate to Network Services, followed by LDAP Client, and then configure the LDAP Client appropriately. Let's find our window here and launch LDAP Client. Again, this is being run across the wire. This will populate our entries. Now, currently, the LDAP client is set not to use LDAP. If we want to use LDAP, we select Use LDAP. If we want to store user accounts and groups and other information in LDAP, but not use LDAP for logins, we select Use LDAP, but disable logins. In our case, we want to store information in LDAP as well as use LDAP to authenticate. Now below we see a field which represents the address of the LDAP server. This is the host name. We need to be sure that it's resolvable from the remote system. So from that SSH shell, let's just be sure that we can ping sending 3 packets to Linux CBT SUSE 2 dot the suffix of the domain, and it responds. This is important because, again, communications is based on effective resolution. The base DN, this is the root of the directory information tree. It's currently set to DC equals Linux CBT, DC equals internal. If yours is set to the default of DC equals my-domain, DC equals com, change it to whatever your base DN is for production purposes or for testing purposes. We have options beneath the LDAP base DN to use TLS, which is the newer version of SSL, or to backtrack to LDAP version 2. Neither are of importance right now. We also see Start Automounter, which allows the Automounter service to export a user's home directory if it exists on a remote location, such as across the wire using NFS. We currently don't have that set up, so we can ignore this option. Notice on the left, as is the case with most, if not all, YAST utilities, there's documentation explaining each of the options. There's an option to create the home directory on login. This is tied into the Automounter in the event that when a user logs into a remote system, if the user's home directory doesn't exist, the Automounter will automatically create a space for the user to store his files. There's also an advanced configuration button. Let's navigate to here. And before we do, let's just explain. If you indicate a server, click on Find. It will use the Service Location Protocol to find an LDAP server, or you indicate the server outright. Once you've indicated a server, providing it's accessible and is running LDAP, you can fetch a base DN, or fetch any exported DN, usually the base DN, by clicking on Fetch DN. Now, let's click on Advanced Configuration to see where users as well as groups will be mapped. This window, the client settings, allows us to manipulate where our users and groups and passwords will be found. We see user map, password map, and group map. These are the three types of maps that are available for us to specify. Notice that they all terminate at the base DN, Linux CBT DC equals internal. Now this isn't where we want to store our base maps for users as well as passwords and groups. Users and passwords, etc password and etc shadow respectively, can share an organizational unit. The group map should have its distinct organizational unit. So let's update each of these. DC equals Linux CBT DC equals internal should become OU equals people, and ditto for the password field. The group field should become OU equals group. Now there's nothing forcing you to use these names. Whatever names you go with for organizational units to contain your users and groups, stick to them. Use them consistently, document them perhaps in a Visio drawing, and so on. But your users and groups must be stored in organizational units. Don't attempt to store them at the root or the base DN. To allow for more flexibility in passwords, let's switch from crypt to MD5. The default group member will suffice as member as opposed to unique member. Some distros of Linux use unique members per user. SUSE Linux uses general member groups that all users are a part of, such as the users group. Let's navigate to administration settings. The home directories will exist on this machine. This is the administrator DN. We don't need to append a base DN as we've already specified it, or it's already been imported. The objects that will be created, the configuration objects that pertain to LDAP, will be stored in a separate organizational unit named LDAP config. We want the default configuration objects to be created. Now, if the objects already exist in your DIT, they will not be created, equivalent to running LDAP add with the -C option to ignore errors. There are some user management settings which we can look at later on. These settings dictate the templates used for the creation of users and or groups. Let's click on Accept, then Finish. We're prompted for the LDAP password, at which point the LDAP client, the YAS LDAP client, will attempt to write the changes to the DIT. And the changes have been written. We know because YAS exited without any errors. So what does this all mean? Well, the LDAP client is set up. Let's just double check again. We'll navigate into LDAP client. The settings should be preserved. We see them here. We'll navigate to Advanced Configuration. We see the various OUs. MD5 is set. Administration settings. If we navigate to Configure User Management, it prompts us for the password to connect, where we see a group configuration template as well as a user configuration template defined. This is the template that will be used by the YAS utility for setting up users. The maximum password length is set to 8. This can be adjusted. Perhaps the minimum should be 8. And the maximum, let's say, is 14 or 15 or whatever works. It's currently set to crypt for the password hash, but it can be changed to MD5. The default base for users will be OU equals people, DC equals Linux CBT, DC equals internal. The default template that's used has a name for creating users. Again, a template, think of a template as a schema, an object class for the creation of users. And ditto for groups. Stored in the group OU, various IDs associated with groups, mins, max, etc. So these settings have already been committed to the directory information tree. This threw an error. Let's just double check what we changed. Make sure that it saved the recent settings. And so far all appears to be well, so it may be an error that we can ignore. Perhaps it's the append base dn, which we don't need because it's already indicated, and now it exited properly. Let's go ahead and just change that one more time. Advanced configuration administration settings, configure user management, and then we'll modify the user configuration group, setting the minimum password length to 8, the maximum perhaps to 14, and accept the changes. And again, the append base dn is what's throwing this off. It's selecting append base dn, so it's throwing us off. That's okay. Nonetheless, we're almost there. Now, how do we ensure that LDAP authentication will work going forward? Let's take a look at some of the things that have changed on the system. We're going to see in etc.ldap.conf settings that pertain to the new setup. Let's take a brief look from the shell. This document now has a base of DC equals Linux CBT, DC equals internal, a default host that's resolvable using etc hosts, and other settings that pertain to the new LDAP environment. If we scroll through, we'll see uncommented items for storing users and groups, reference with an NSS prefix. We have not routed, however, other maps like hosts files, services file, protocols file. But here we see NSS base password, which gets stored in the people OU, NSS base shadow, which is also stored in the people OU, and NSS base group, which is stored in the group OU. So the client ldap.conf file has been updated, as we've mentioned earlier, would be. In addition, if we use YAST to create a new user, we'll have the option of creating either in the local etc password file or on the LDAP server. So let's try as a separate task to create a new LDAP user. So we'll use YAST. If you didn't have a graphical tool like YAST, you could use the LDAP add command and the appropriate LDIF entries to effect that change. So in YAST, we'll navigate to Security and Users and attempt to manage users. User Management, and once in User Management, we see the etc password database. That's what's reflected in this window. Notice there's a button to the lower right where I'm hovering for LDAP options. LDAP search filter, LDAP user and group configuration. You can set your search filter to be whatever object class that matches or suits this application's needs. It defaults to POSIX account. You can make changes to the user and group configuration, which prompts you to authenticate to the LDAP server and brings up the LDAP window, which allows you to manipulate the user and group templates, which are used for defining users and groups. You may also add users. Click on Add. This Add User option, however, by default adds to etc password, the local user accounts database. Let's just prove it. We'll call this user Linux CBT LDAP test, and we'll subsequently delete the user. Let's commit the user, and it indicates the password is very simple, which is true, but we're just proving the point that the user is written to etc password as opposed to LDAP. And from a shell, let's grep LDAP from password. And there's a user, linuxcbt LDAP test. So the user was indeed added to the local etc password account. So your security and users tool defaults to adding users to etc password. Now let's try to add an LDAP user. Back to user management in YAST. We'll navigate to the lower right, set filter, and instead of local users or system users like root or @ or daemon, local users such as dean, linuxcbt LDAP tests, we'll navigate to LDAP users. This prompts us again to authenticate as the root DN. Once in, any users defined will be displayed. Navigate to groups, any groups defined will be displayed. A default group named users has already been created in the LDAP database, which means we could LDAP search to find it from the shell. Let's run a recent instance of LDAP search and modify it to suit our needs. We'll change the OU to group, and there you see it dumps the contents of this organizational unit. So back to users, we click on add and the form will look slightly different. We'll indicate a user. We'll call it linuxcbt LDAP 1. And by the way, if you attempt to create a user that's already defined in etc password, YAST will complain, as the NSS configuration, the name service switch configuration, is set to consult both etc password and LDAP. So in order for it to distinguish between users, it needs to know that its databases contain unique users. We'll set the password, and there are other fields such as details. It tells us it's simple, but that's fine. These are additional fields such as the user ID, the default home directory, the login shell to use when the user connects, any additional groups the user should be a member of, any plugins, LDAP related entries that tie it into other items such as Samba, or even the ability to modify the password policy, the current password policy. Click on launch, change the policy, then create the user. But in the interest of saving time, we'll just go ahead and create the user. We'll click on accept, then finish. Now it tells us that there's a missing package, crypt config. Currently, the password policy is set to encrypt the user's password in LDAP using crypt, and it needs crypt config to carry out that change. So we need to ensure that the server has access to the RPMs. It's prompting us, so we'll supply it with the DVD. And now it appears to be taking, so crypt config will be copied momentarily. Again, we're setting this up with basic auth. It would be more ideal to use a stronger mechanism for protecting passwords such as MD5, but for now, for our intents and purposes, just to illustrate the point, we'll go with the default, and we can always tweak as we go along. Momentarily, we'll have this newly created user in our directory information tree, and we'll subsequently be able to authenticate to the system as the user. So now let's clear screen and rerun LDAP search to see the new user. We'll change the organizational unit to people, and in people we see linuxcbt LDAP 1. This is the new user. The user belongs to the people OU. Its RDN, by the way, is Linux CBT LDAP1, and its entire DN is the full string that you see here. UID is the name used by Unix and Linux to identify the user. The CN is first name, last name, GID number, given name, home directory. All these things have been set. The login shell, the object class, it belongs to top as well as POSIX account and INET org person. Surname, UID, UID number 1002. So we've now got a new user created in the LDAP tree. Now there are multiple ways to add users, as we've mentioned. You can use LDAP add using this LDIF syntax, and so long as you use unique ID numbers, then the user will be added to the DIT. Or you can use a streamlined tool such as YAST or the LDAP browser. So you've got three ways within a SUSE environment to add users to the LDAP tree. Now, let's just take a brief look at the NSS changes that have been made. We did mention that the name service switch process or library reads nsswitch.conf. As we scroll through this document, nothing appears to be different. References to passwords and groups use the compatible option. However, as we scroll through, we'll see that there are some entries that have been updated, such as services, which now uses files or LDAP and or LDAP. Ditto for net group, as well as aliases. So the compatible options for password and group ensures that the authentication process references the LDAP server. Now, when connecting to the server using a protocol such as SSH, SSH needs to reference PAM to use LDAP. And back to our original graphic, that means we will need to update the PAM configuration as far as protocols like SSH and FTP and others are concerned to take advantage of this new LDAP setup. Now, for general authentication, such as from the console, if you're connected at the console via a local TTY, there is another file beneath etc security that is used for general authentication. Let's navigate into security. And in security, we see multiple files that pertain to PAM. However, pam_unix2.conf is the key file. Let's list the contents of pam_unix2.conf, where we'll find that for authentication and account management, as well as passwords, the system is now set to use LDAP. This is for general authentication, such as for logging in from a local TTY, not from a remote interface such as SSH. So here we see use LDAP for authentication and for accounting and for password management. All of this has been updated for us by the LDAP client utility that's included within YAST. For other distributions that are not so streamlined, you'll have to make these loose changes manually. You'll have to navigate to each of the files and update them one at a time. But again, just so that we understand the framework here and the changes that have been made, in order to set up LDAP on our server such that our client can make use of it, we used YAS. YAS set up some default OUs, including people and group, and an LDAP config OU for storing configuration information. YAS also updated the name service switch facility so that in addition to etc password, LDAP can be consulted. It also updated the general PAM interface so that for connecting via login and local access, LDAP can be consulted. But beyond that, we'll need to update each of the entries. Now, the PAM configuration comes with LDAP-enabled configuration files. So in the documentation directory on your SUSE box in user share, there are a series of LDAP files that we can simply copy or deposit into the PAM directory, overriding or replacing the pre-existing version, restart the service, that's in question, such as SSH, and that service will now authenticate using a combination of local etc password as well as LDAP. So there are many files in place to help make the process, the transition, easier, to smoothen the transition. We don't have to do everything manually, and distributions like SUSE Linux make the conversion much easier. So just to recap, we've now set up our system to use LDAP as well as local etc password authentication. And we did so that we can take advantage of LDAP authentication. LDAP authentication and LDAP in general allows us to distribute key etc database flat files, or flat files that function as databases such as etc hosts, group, password, services, protocols, etc. One of the neat things about SUSE Linux is that it streamlines the migration from etc password to etc password and LDAP via its LIAS interface. Using LIAS allows us to see the changes that take place under the hood so that we can effect those changes in other distributions. So we set up LDAP auth for users and groups by connecting to the remote system using SSH with X turned on so we could export the graphics back to our local system. We navigated to network services, LDAP client, and from LDAP client we were able to make all the changes we needed to make to set up the client or this system as a true LDAP client. We had to specify key options such as where to find the LDAP server, the base DN to search, whether or not TLS or SSL should be enabled, whether or not to revert to LDAP version 2, whether or not to start an auto mounter for mounting remote home directories, whether or not to create a home directory on login for users who do make use of auto mounting. We navigated to advanced options and we configured organizational units for the different maps. User and password maps can share the same people OU or any OU that you'd like to name, such as users. The group map has a distinct OU for maintaining its attribute value pairs. The password change protocol, we currently have it set to MD5, but it's being encrypted using crypt, so we need to rectify this either by sticking with crypt or migrating everything to MD5 sooner than later. We also navigated to administration settings. We included the administrator DN. We disabled append-based DN, but it keeps reinstating. The default configuration-based DN was there. We selected create default configuration objects so that any of the OUs that don't exist are created by this process. And that's really all there was to it to have it set up on our system. So now we're in place and we can move on with our configuration and exploration of LDAP.